consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Linh Vu, an assistant professor of history at Arizona State University, to talk about her book, Governing the Dead: Martyrs, Memorials, and Necrocitizenship in Modern China. Dr. Vu, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk about my book.
Yeah, so your book, it's called Governing the Dead. Can you just expand on what you mean by this title a little bit and connect that to what it is you're arguing, this sort of overarching theme in your book? And if you could give a little bit of historical context to what exactly is going on here.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I'm very happy with my title. I came up with this title pretty late, probably right before I finished revising my dissertation into this book. So during the course of writing the book, I came across a lot of stories about dead people. Martyrs, biographies, compensation policies from the nationalist government in China, and stories of widows applying to the government for compensation because their husbands or sons or fathers died during the early 20th century. So there were a lot of pieces of information, and I was just kind of struggling to bring all these pieces together into a monograph. So eventually it came to me that, all these stories of martyrs, all these compensation policies for widows and things like that, they are part of the effort of the nation state to govern the dead, which is in a way to, mobilize the dead to further the narrative of the nation state and mobilize people to fight for the nation. Especially in China during this time, there were, multiple wars going on, and especially the war against the Japanese army was pretty intense. So part of the nationalist Chinese effort was to mobilize people to fight the Japanese. And there have been a lot of works about, mobilizing the living. But for this book, I think my contribution is that the state also cared about the dead, and the dead, even though they, no longer alive, mobile, they can no longer speak, they actually can really contribute to furthering the narrative of, fighting against the enemy, sacrificing the life for the nation and things like that. That's sort of what the title means.
So for this next question, I just want to start us off with a quote from your book. You write, quote, "An episode of 3 Wuchang Uprising martyrs shows how the dead played a key role in legitimizing post-imperial powers," end quote. So my question has a few parts here. In the ROC era, how did the government choose who to promote and why? What qualities did they look for? And what goals did promoting these deceased individuals achieve?
Yes, so as you know, at the end of the 19th century and during the early 20th century, there were a lot of political movements in China. Some of them were sort of led by the Revolutionary Alliance, which is the Tongmenghui, that was founded by Sun Yat-sen. So there were a lot of movements, and a lot of them did not follow the, Sun Yat-sen's idea, or later what it became the nationalist government's ideas at all. But when the nationalist government established itself in Guangzhou in 1925 and later in Nanjing in 1928, it decided that, all these political activists that fought against the Qing dynasty, they could be honored as nationalist or Republican martyrs. And in a way, they create this very coherent narrative that the Qing was corrupt and all these people follow the leadership of Sun Yat-sen of the nationalist government, and they fought against imperial power. So this is why the 1911 uprising in Wuchang that led to the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, those martyrs, the people who participated in that movement were commemorated as martyr, even though it was a, if you study Chinese history, it was a new army uprising. The Qing modernized the military at the end of the 19th century, and a lot of these officials began to have a lot of power, and the uprising was sort of their plan instead of the Sun Yat-sen's political faction. So when the nationalist government collected all these stories about martyrs, they also added to the narratives of those martyrs. So not only, they try to portray those people die heroically for the nation state, for China, for the Republic of China, but the government also created a narrative that those people were very filial sons who actually also enjoy a very happy marriage before they, went out and sacrificed their lives for political ideals. So I think this is very significant because it shows that, a martyr's life is not just the moment of death, but also it's a life well lived. And if you study Chinese history, or just a little bit about Chinese culture, that Confucianism is still, I think, has been and still is the foundation of Chinese society. And the idea that you go out and you sacrifice your life, this is very anti-Confucianism. This is very un-Confucian in many ways. So to create those stories about filial sons, who cared for their parents and make sure that they would have an heir to continue the family line after they died. Those stories became part of the martyrs' lives. So all the martyrs, they would get married, they would make sure that their wives carry sons, and then they would go and sacrifice their life. So in many ways, it's a very well-rounded story for young men and even young women to emulate. So this is it's just not a story that is that ends there, but it's a story that for later generations to study and to take after and to try to create the same stories, which is living a very well fulfilled life and then went on to die for the nation.
Well, part of what you said there leads pretty well into the next question that I have, which is, how did these families, if you have some examples, feel about the state essentially propagandizing the dead bodies of soldiers? Do we have instances of resistance? And if so, what did that look like? And also, you talk about Confucianism. Were there Confucian officials or Taoists or Buddhists that expressed their discomfort with this propagandizing of the dead body? Did they say, basically, just leave it to rest? Don't give it sort of a second life after this person's death?
So there are two questions in there. Yes, so one of the main arguments from my book is that the families were happy with most of the time. They were happy with what the state was doing because, the ending of the civil service examination system, ward was changing. How can you sort of separate yourself from the rest? And this is part of what you have to do, as human beings and also as humans in society. You need to distinguish yourself. So when the state came and bestowed this honors of martyrdom on their relatives, of course, the families were happy, and especially the title of martyrdom often came with, a stipend, a one-time stipend or an annual stipend for, a decade or so, sort of to compensate the family for the loss of their patriarch in many ways. So most families were happy. Of course, there were some stories. Most of the stories were about the families were not happy with the amount of money that they received, or they thought that their husbands, fathers, or sons deserved a lot more. So they asked for a lot of benefits from the government. I did 5 stories about families that disagree with the portrayal of, their loved ones by the government, and they protested against it, and they didn't want their loved one to be buried in a designated spot that the government thought that would be befitting for a martyr, and they want to bury their loved one in their hometown, as tradition dictates. So there were those stories, but they're pretty rare, and especially given the fact that I work mostly with government sources. Of course, I also have newspapers reports, and all these stories that the families submit to the state. They sort of give a more grassroots level of narrative, but most of the time, I did not encounter a lot of resistance. In terms of other religions, I think, in my opinion, it's pretty much that the Chinese people, they believed in an afterlife. The dead did not just disappear, or most cultures there is some sort of understanding of the dead did not just vanish into thin air, but they continue to live among the living, or live somewhere that the living eventually would go there too. So because of the belief in the afterlife, it is very convenient for the state to appropriate that and say, and instead of saying that in the afterlife people live in heaven or hell, or live in this nice little place, the state will say in the afterlife of this martyrs that they still have this spirit, right? They still have their qingsheng, the spirit, their huan. But the state used this idea and sort of create the narrative that the afterlife of these martyrs is to mobilize the people to continue to contribute to the nation. The spirit of these martyrs live on, and they sort of the spirits still continue to contribute to the nation state. So so basically, the nation state latched on this idea that there is an afterlife. It is a political afterlife instead of a religious one.
So as we're doing this interview, I've just recently started reading Rana Mitter's book, China's Good War. And there's a few points that I'm struck by in reading it that I think sort of has a little bit of overlap with what it is that you're doing. One thing that he writes about is how in modern times, in historical representations and even literary and filmic representations of the Kuomintang, the CCP has sort of rehabilitated their image as increasingly being seen as less of an enemy and more as sort of a brother in arms, as helping them overthrow the imperial Japanese. So I wonder if in your research, if you maybe saw some instances of thinking a little more about now the CCP commemorating members of the Kuomintang military, if that's something that happens at all these days.
So my book, the narrative sort of end with 1949, because you can write a very long book if you try to cover everything. So so I didn't really talk much about sort of the Chinese Communist Party try to commemorate World War II martyrs. I did have some in the epilogue, and actually expanded it for other publications. And in one of my articles, it's called Commemorative Contention, and it talked about the martyr shrines in Taiwan. I did talk a little bit about the sort of memory wars between mainland China and Taiwan, and how both nation states, if you can think of them as both nation states, despite the one China policy, they sort of compete for the narrative, which one contributed more for the war of resistance, which is the war against Japan. So yes, I think they, instead of seeing those soldiers fighting during World War II as, belong to a political party, both sides of the strait, both governments consider those martyrs as, anti-Japanese heroes fighting for China. And it sort of fit into this one China policy still because, China can be two different things or even more if you think about it. So yes, there is a sort of a change in narrative that the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Republic of China started to commemorate those martyrs, acknowledge the contribution of the nationalist parties in fighting the Japanese. So yeah, I think so.
And again, you do mention that your book ends at 1949, but if we can maybe try to connect it a little bit more to current times, can you maybe comment just a little bit on, in the Republic of China and Taiwan, what commemoration of the dead looks like today? What are some important political themes that we're seeing coming out of this commemoration and ceremonies and the like?
Yeah, I since the station in China and also Taiwan are pretty difficult. It's very difficult for foreign researchers to get to. So I've been trying to bring the narrative to the present. And as I say, my article is in Modern Asian Studies Journal. I talk a lot about the commemoration of the war dead in the Republic of China, Taiwan. And basically, even with a new party in charge now, the new parties pretty much follow a lot of the traditions set up by the Nationalist Party. And so that continue to be, playing a very important role in sort of creating a coherent narrative of what is China. And of course, there have been a lot of pushback concerning, the authoritarianism of the Nationalist Party, especially during the martial law period. But even now, during my course of research, I found that, the current president of Republic of China, Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, she also carry out all these ceremonies in the Martyrs Shrine in Taipei. And even though at the beginning she was a little bit resisting the idea that she's commemorating Nationalist Party martyrs, but eventually, those ceremonies, it was create a narrative for the nation, and it seems that it's still being carried out no matter what. And also, just for comparison, I also worked a little bit about the Babaoshan, the 8 Treasures Mountain Revolutionary Cemeteries in Beijing. And my understanding is that the dead continue to play a very important role. It is very important for, even the supposedly communist, atheist political party in China. They continue to, allow people to conduct all this, the grave sweeping ceremonies in the spring and autumn, sacrifice for the dead. So at the Revolutionary Cemetery, there is for very high-ranking cadres of the Chinese Communist Party, the worshiping activities still being carried out, and the state continue to rely on the dead to further the narrative that the nation has this history way back, and all these people contribute to the existence of the nation state. Thus, it must be a valid existence.
Before we wrap up, just one last question. What do you hope that people will walk away with after reading your book? How do you hope that what you have to say will in some way reshape the way that they think about the Republic of China and their politics?
If I could pick one thing, because, as someone who was writing her first book, I kind of have to think about what sources I have available. And I depended, on the availability of the sources. And most of the time, as China is a very good bureaucratic, it's a slip of tongue, I say democratic. It's a bureaucratic nation. or bureaucratic state since the beginning of the empire. So there are a lot of records that the state kept, and that really benefits what I can do with my book. So in many ways, it's a top-down narrative of how the state managed the dead and mobilized the dead, and further the narrative of the nation state. But I really want people to read the sort of beginning stories that I have for each chapter. This is where I really try to show that this is not just a book about what the state did. This is a book about how people interacted with the state. So I have all these stories, a story about a martyr that died. And his life was sort of recorded in this biography, and he was hanging out with his friends, and they plotted, and he got all these sort of troubles in his life. He went to Japan to study, and then he couldn't find a job at some point, or he got a job but he was very unhappy with his job. It's very common human sort of experience. And then eventually he met some friends coming back from, this is a story about Martyr Championship. And he met some friends coming back from Hong Kong, and there was a news about, a revolution coming. And then he plotted, he joined the revolution, and then he went with his friends on a boat, and they had conversations. And, he pretended he was upset about having to leave his beautiful wife back at home. And then people started to feel sad, and he stood up and said, we are revolutionaries, we should not think this way, and things like that. So it's and then I have another stories about widows petitioning to the state, and how they sort of try to keep filing petitions after petitions, explaining why they really deserve the compensation from the states and things like that. So there were a lot of interactions. There were a lot of stories from the people on the ground, even though those stories were sort of filtered through the bureaucratic channels, which means that they have a narrative, they have to fit the form. But I think it is very important that I bring those stories into the book, and I think it will be great for the readers to pay attention to those stories and think about the people that experienced wars in China, and how they managed to, carve out a living for themselves. Of course, in many ways they have to rely on the state. They have to negotiate with the state, which had more power over them than they would have over the state. But in any ways, their bargaining chip is the stories that they had, the experience, the sort of the suffering. There are a lot of stories about people losing their patriarchs, their husbands, and they would have to, they live in poverty, and they couldn't raise their sons for a decade or so, and they hope the state would compensate them and sort of restore their family's life to the standard that it was. So I think it's important to know that those people existed. I mean, they were real historical figures, and the way they managed their lives can really give us some sense of what it was for people who lived through wartime. And it sort of resonates with, unfortunately, what's going on in the world today in different in various parts of the world. That people still experience wars to a certain extent, and they still have to rely on the state or sort of other organizations to survive, and it's very hard, and it's very difficult. So hopefully my book would be read beyond the field of modern Chinese history, and people could find the common strengths of humanity in the book.
Dr. Vu, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope people enjoy the book.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.